So why don't we get started? So welcome everybody. My name is Thomas DePreet. I'm a professor of sociology here at Columbia, and I'm the co-director of the Columbia Institute for Social and Economic Research and Policy, also known as ISERP. So ISERP, along with the Barnard Sociology Department, social science departments from Columbia, and the Columbia Heyman Center for the Humanities, is sponsoring today's event. And this is the last in a series of 5 events that have been held this academic year under the theme of coming to terms with a polarized society. And the series is intended to serve as a forum for consideration and debate of important trends that are having a profound effect on multiple aspects of American society. So today's event is titled Importing Political Polarization, the Electoral Consequences of Rising Trade Exposure. And David Autor will be the lead speaker, and then Thomas Edsall and Alan Krueger will offer comment and perspective. And after the 3 speakers have each had an opportunity to speak and respond to each other's comments, we're going to open up the discussion to include the audience via Q&A. So I'm going to start off introducing all 3 speakers, and then I'll let them proceed. So David Autor is the Ford Professor of Economics at MIT, where he co-directs the School Effectiveness and Inequality Initiative. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and has been the editor of the Journal of Labor Economics, the Journal of Economic Perspectives, and the Review of Economics and Statistics. David's one of the world's leading labor economists, and his work on how technological change has produced rising inequality in the labor market has been seminal to our understanding of the inequality trends that arguably have been a major driver of the political, social, and cultural polarization that today characterizes American society. Thomas Edsall is a journalist and scholar. He was a national political reporter for 25 years for the Washington Post, and he was the Joseph Pulitzer II and Elizabeth Pulitzer Moore Professor at the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism from 2006 to 2014. He's the author of several books, including Building Red America, The New Conservative Coalition and the Drive for Permanent Power, and The Age of Austerity, How Scarcity Will Remake American Politics. And he currently writes a weekly opinion column, really a must-read political opinion column for the online version of the New York Times. Alan Krueger is the Bendheim Professor of Economics and Public Affairs at Princeton University. Alan was chief economist of the Department of Labor under President George W. Bush.
No.
Is that
Nope.
wrong? What year?
Clinton. Definitely not.
Clinton.
2005?
Clinton.
What?
94.
Oh, 94. Oh,
Clinton.
there's a-
Clinton.
Little difference.
So there's, okay, I'll say there's a typo actually in under Bill Clinton. Okay, so I took Wikipedia as gospel, but just so you know. Alan was chief economist of the Department of Labor. He was the assistant secretary of the Treasury for Economic Policy under President Barack Obama, and was subsequently the chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisors under President Obama. Aside from his many seminal papers in leading economics journals, Alan's the co-author of several books, including Inequality in America, What Role for Human Capital Policies. And he was also for many years a regular contributor to the economic scene column of the New York Times. And so without further ado, David.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. It's an honor to be invited. I have close connections to many of these people. I've known Tom's work for many years. Tom, Edsall, and I correspond regularly around the work that the things that he's writing about. And Alan was one of my mentors and advisors when I was a graduate student. So it is an honor, and of course, actually, in all candor, my mom went to Barnard as well. So I'm going to talk about some of the electoral consequences of the change in trading conditions facing the United States over the last 20 years. And I'm going to synthesize some of my work and some other work and try to tell a coherent story. And let me just sort of dive in and set the stage, and then before I even get to the analytic part of the talk, I want to give you a sense of the landscape. Some of you will know this well. Some of you, hopefully, this will be informative. So, the conservative liberal ideological axis in the Congress and House of Representatives or Senate is typically measured using the Poole-Rosenthal scores. I won't go into technical details, but they're essentially a measure of ideological affiliation based on people's voting patterns within the Senate or the House, depending on whether they're a senator or representative. And it's this, and because they're based on roll call votes, and all roll call votes are recorded for all of U.S. history, we can look at the difference between typical Democrats and typical Republicans over the course of more than 100 years. And it's frequently noted, if you look at these series, that starting in the late 1970s or early 1980s, there's a substantial divergence. Higher values on this scale refer to more conservative voting patterns, lower values, more liberal voting patterns. And you can see that Republicans start veering sharply in the more conservative direction. Democrats become a little more liberal. It's interesting to note Southern Democrats are the yellow line, Northern Democrats are the red line, and then the dark red is the average of the two. Northern Democrats have not become more liberal. Southern Democrats have become a little bit more liberal, but of course there are many fewer Southern Democrats, so the overall weight of the Democratic Party, as represented in the House and Senate, has become more liberal. So the parties are pulling further apart on average. And just to see how far they've pulled apart, this figure shows you the nominate scores of the House between 1992 and 2012. And the dark red and dark blue lines are the mean nominate scores of Republicans and Democrats, respectively. The thick dashed lines are the 5th and 95th percentile, so most conservative, 5th and 95th percentile conservative, 95th percentile conservative, and so on. And then the light dashed lines are the extremes, the most conservative, the most liberal, et cetera. And what's notable is after the year 2000, there's actually no overlap in the nominate scores of these parties. In other words, by this measure, the most conservative Democrat is more liberal than the most liberal Republican. So it does suggest there has been an important divergence in the voting behavior, arguably the ideology of those who were elected to the Congress. It's worth it to ask, well, do we see something similar in the public? Is this representative of the views of constituents? It's hard to measure ideological polarization. I think the organization that does a very nice job of this is the Pew Foundation that does a lot of surveying. And they have for a couple of decades been running a survey where they try to measure ideological affiliation by asking a series of loaded questions on a 10-point scale. So for example, the first question, you may or may not be able to read this, is government regulation of business usually does more harm than good. And so agreeing with that so this is the proportion agreeing, and you can see among people who affiliate as Republicans, that proportion is rising. Among people who affiliate as Democrats, that proportion is falling. If you look in the third box, poor people have it easy because they can get government benefits without doing anything in return. The proportion of Republicans endorsing that is rising, the proportion of Democrats endorsing that is falling. Here's another example. Blacks who can't get ahead in this country are mostly responsible for their own condition. So the proportion of Republicans endorsing that has risen from 68 to 75. The proportion of Democrats endorsing that has risen from 53 to 28. So you can just take these scales and aggregate them together to get a measure of people's ideological affiliation in this very simple metric. And what's interesting to see is how far apart the parties have moved. So in 1994, 64% of Republicans were to the right of the median Democrat. Now, if they were exactly on top of each other, you'd expect it to be 50%. So that's not very far apart. By 2017, 95% of Republicans were more conservative than the median Democrat, and 97% of Democrats were more liberal than the median Republican. Here's another way to look at it. This just overlays the two distributions. And you can see that, at the outset, they look like almost like a normal distribution. By 2017, this is a bimodal distribution, right? These are twin peaks. And what's interesting about this is part of this is the parties are pulling further apart on each question, but part of it is the clustering of views is becoming more predictable. So in other words, your views on tax policy are much more predictive of your views on the environment or on homosexuality than they were 20 years ago, maybe not you individually, but on average. And there's, and that clustering, that ideological agglomeration into these two camps has become, very charged. So much so that they ask questions about, do you think that people with the other views are actively harmful to you in the country, and the proportion of that, of people endorsing that view is rising? Or even, would you approve of your child intermarrying, meaning marrying across party lines? And the fraction of households that don't approve of intermarriage across a political party has risen substantially. So we do see, there has been a long-running discussion about whether the polarization of Congress is reflective of the polarization of the populace. It's not clear that they really have the same timing, but at present the evidence suggests that that is true. They're both highly polarized ideologically. I should say that if you look at by demographic group, you'll see that white non-Hispanics are moving strongly to the right. They're increasingly in the red group, strongly conservative, at the expense of moderates. And among Hispanics and non-whites more broadly, there's less change, but that change which is occurring is moderates are becoming more liberal. So this breaks down strongly along demographic lines. So here are the 4 points that I want to talk about. One is, what are the causes? And in particular, I'm going to talk about broad causes, and I'm going to focus specifically on this question of trade and polarization, not to argue that trade is the primary underlying cause, it's not, but that it may be to explore the evidence of whether it has been an important catalyst. Then I'm going to tell you how we test that empirically, and then I'm going to try to answer 4 questions. One, whether we see the effect of trade in generating ideological shifts within the electorate, whether it changes the character of House races by making them more competitive or contested, whether it causes turnover within or across parties, and finally whether it causes changes in the ideological affiliation of those elected. And I'm going to look at ideological affiliation by using those nominate scores. Finally, in the 4th part, I'll talk very briefly about the role that trade may have played in the recent presidential election that you heard about, probably. Okay, so some big picture. Why is ideological polarization rising? I don't think there's a well-established consensus set of theories. A lot of recent evidence, or a lot of recent social science, talks about moral identity and authoritarian tendencies. So the work of Jonathan Haidt on, I might be mispronouncing it, universalist versus tribalist sentiments. So universalist sentiment is justice. Everyone should be given, should be treated justly, versus a tribalist sentiment is loyalty, which is I owe loyalty to a set of people, but that's not a universal idea. And these are both, in some sense, esteemed virtues, but they are in tension. And the notion is that that many would associate those tribalist virtues more with conservative ideology, and the universalist ones more with liberal ideology. Another incarnation of this is the work of Heatherton and Weiler, where they talk about openness versus orderliness. I could go on, and in fact, Tom Edsall probably could do a very good job summarizing this information. And we know that the political divides seem to be rising along these dimensions of moral or social preference. But I don't really think the literature explains why these schisms are growing. I think it's an excellent characterization. I think it leaves causal mechanisms open. The social science literature on this topic is large. I don't think it's highly conclusive. Others may disagree with me on that. One thing we know is that polarization, ideological polarization, tends to rise following financial crises. Of course, we've just undergone one, as has all of Europe. Circumstantially, we know that ideological polarization has followed economic polarization, the rise of inequality, although it's not clear that we've established a tight link there. We know that we do see stronger ideological sorting, as I mentioned. There's a lot of good work on the rise of media partisanship. There's no question that our media is more partisan than it used to be. Whether that's having a large effect or a modest effect is unclear. Lots of good work. Some ideas that make a lot of sense but haven't received a lot of empirical support is the notion of the big sort of people kind of moving into enclaves where they're just, physically and intellectually segregated. It's not clear that that's really occurring. Gerrymandering, although it is a very powerful force, it's not clear it's changed enough to have the effects that we observe. I think there are also an interesting emerging hypothesis, or a couple of them that I've seen recently. One is this notion of the kind of rising urban-rural divide, which you see in the US and throughout Europe, of kind of the clustering of prosperity and growth into a small number of kind of hyper-successful cities and downward economic mobility, in many other places in small cities and in the suburbs. You could argue that was characteristic of the Trump election, of Brexit, and so on. There's also a lot of recent work focusing on the effect of automation, and even work on robotics and voting. I think it's a little premature, but there's some really interesting work there. So now let me talk about the work that I'm going to focus on here, which is asking whether the China trade shock to US manufacturing contributed to the widening ideological divide through its effect on regional economies. So just to put this in perspective, and some of you will be highly familiar with this already, this red line at the bottom shows you China's share of world manufacturing exports from between 1985 and roughly 2015, and it goes from effectively 0 or a quarter percentage point to almost 20 percentage points in that short 30-year period. And that's a remarkable change in global competitive conditions. It coincides with a fall in the US share of global manufacturing exports, so that's the dark blue line. And China's rise is a world historic achievement. Whenever one talks about the modest adverse consequences this may or may not have had for the US, you always want to put that in perspective of, from a kind of a world historic welfare level, this is fabulous, right? China's rise brought 400 million Chinese out of poverty very rapidly, but it also created prosperity throughout Central and South America, investment in sub-Saharan Africa. So it's been the best thing for the global middle class in kind of all of world history. But nevertheless, it was a big change. It was fairly disruptive. And as China rapidly became highly productive, highly competitive, and took over many labor-intensive manufacturing activities and industries, it had large displacement effects. And among developed countries, the US in particular, the US was an outlier in being particularly affected by it because the US is much more engaged in labor-intensive manufacturing than most other advanced economies. We're a lower wage economy. Larger economies tend to produce more for themselves. So much of the things that we were producing that were directly affected by China's rise, so shoes, textiles, leather goods, commodity furniture, toys, many assembly things, many of those are not even done in advanced European economies, but are done in the United States. So as China rapidly gained comparative advantage in those activities, it had a fairly dramatic displacement effect on the US, and I'll document that in a second. So one way you can see this is, this shows you the numerical count of US manufacturing workers between 1939 and 2016. And you can see the high point of US manufacturing employment in the post-war period initially was 16.5 million at the end of the Second World War. That was a very large share of US employment at that time. It was a little more than 30% of all jobs. But actually numerically, US manufacturing employment continued to grow such that by 1979, it reached its high water mark of almost 20 million workers. It then declined modestly between 79 and 99 by about 2 more million workers. And then between 1999 and 2007, it lost 20% of all employment. And then over the subsequent few years, lost another 13%. So US manufacturing employment fell from 17.3 million to 11.5 million in just an 8-year period. Now, of course, An important part of that is the Great Recession happening in 2007. So, you could say this part is most immediately associated with China's accession to the World Trade Organization and the flood of imports and the rise of the US trade deficit. This period here has a lot to do with the Great Recession. And then, of course, there has been a modest rebound in the last few years. But that's a big change. Although you often hear US manufacturing has been in decline since the end of the Second World War, there's been no period in which it lost such a large share of jobs so rapidly. Most of it has been a kind of a gradual decline as a share of employment. It has not been these kind of waterfall, over the waterfall kind of thing. And of course, exposure to that contraction varies enormously across geographies of the United States. So darker colors correspond to more manufacturing here. Manufacturing is heavily concentrated in the Mid-Atlantic, in the South Atlantic, in the Southeast, and so on. And I should say that even within manufacturing, different parts of the US geography are much more exposed to China's rise than others because they're much more engaged in labor-intensive manufacturing. So around the Great Lakes area, you have a lot of heavy industry, a lot, automotive and machine tools and so on. But down in the South, the Deep South, and the South Atlantic, you have a lot more of textiles, shoes, commodity furniture, and those are the areas that were most immediately exposed to China's rise because those are the areas where those were the types of goods China, a labor-abundant economy that was not very high-tech at the time, moved into rapidly. Just to give you some sense of what this looks like, these are just a set of bubble plots from a recent nice paper by Charles Hurston Schwartz, and they show you between 2000 and 2016, on the x-axis is the share of the population engaged in manufacturing among prime-age adults in the year 2000, and on the y-axis is the fall in that share. So essentially, for every 10 manufacturing jobs a place had initially, on average, they lost about 2.5% of them. And you can say, well, all right, that's manufacturing. What effect, how did that predict the overall change in labor force participation? Maybe people very quickly moved into non-manufacturing, right? Manufacturing is not everything. This shows you that picture for men and women, prime-age adults. This is the share of the population in manufacturing, and this is the change in the employment to population rate, so the fraction of adults working in a job. And essentially, for every 10 manufacturing jobs, so the slope of, for every 10 manufacturing jobs that were present, the male employment to population rate fell by about 3 jobs, so about a 30% reduction. And for women, it was not quite as dramatic, but also very sizable. Now, these are just very simple descriptive scatter plots. This doesn't attempt to isolate cause and effect, but it gives you some sense of where manufacturing was prevalent. It declined heavily. Workers left manufacturing, and they did not move into non-manufacturing robustly. In fact, employment fell a lot. Okay, so why might those shocks have had political consequences? Well, manufacturing workers are disproportionately males. They're disproportionately non-college adults, although there are many college-educated workers in manufacturing. And they're particularly in the Midwest and in the Southeast. This is the less educated, lower-paid parts of U.S. manufacturing. And so this particular shock was very concentrated on a vulnerable group. And just to give you some sense of, why is manufacturing distinctive? People talk about manufacturing all the time. The economist Jagdish Bhagwati, who's an emeritus faculty member here, often refers to this notion of manufacturing fetishism, the idea that people sort of think of manufacturing jobs as more special, as different from other employment. And I used to think that was a very funny quip, and it is a very funny quip, actually. But I also think it's wrong. I do actually think manufacturing employment is quite distinctive. What makes it distinctive? So this shows you just cross-sectionally comparing men and women, young men and women in manufacturing relative to other adults in the same labor market, commuting zone, a couple of counties, with the same education and experience approximately. And what you see is that men and women working in manufacturing, they earn about $5,000 or $6,000 more per year. So that's about 19 to 25% more. They have higher annual hours, and they have higher hourly wages. So relative to the alternative jobs in which low-educated adults are working, workers in manufacturing do appear to have higher earnings and more stability, and part of that comes from the fact that they work more hours per year. Right? That's sort of in the nature of manufacturing. It's shift work. It tends to be more stable than a lot of service jobs. So I'll just say that, let me not focus on the slide except to say this tries to estimate the degree to which men and women were exposed to the shock. Where we saw trade shocks occur, what did we see happen to male and female employment? Looking overall for let's say a standard deviation shock, kind of what would be experienced by roughly 2/3 of the population, we saw male employment to population rates fall by about 3%. We saw very small declines in, let me focus on the green line, I apologize. We saw male employment population rates fall by about 1.5%, female employment population rates fall by about 0.9%. The blue and the orange try to separate those into shocks concentrated on male manufacturing, shocks concentrated on female manufacturing. You can see they have larger effects on the groups for whom they're concentrated. So we did see big declines in employment, larger among men than women. We also see considerable falls in earnings. So this plots men's and women's earnings by percentile from low to high, and then plots the change in dollars of annual income as a function of exposure to the trade shock. You can see that the dollar losses are larger among high-income workers. That's not altogether surprising. They have more to lose. However, if you look at the proportionate losses, you will see that the proportionate losses are much larger for low earnings men than for low earnings women. So these shocks do tend to reduce considerably the average male earnings advantage in these labor markets. You could say they reduce the economic stature of men. So particularly what this says, for example, is at the 20th percentile, or let's say the 25th percentile of the earnings distribution, these lower the gap between men and women's annual earnings by about 5% as a function of men's initial level. So not a trivial change. They also affect, as we estimate it, household structure. So in areas where we see these trade shocks occurring, we see a decline in the fraction of women 18 to 39 who are currently married, and a rise in the fraction never married. So these are actually not household separations, but simply a slowing of the entry rate into marriage. And consequently, a decline in the fraction of women living with male partner, or living with any partner, and more of them living in single-headed households. I don't have the figure here to demonstrate that, but that would also be true if we looked at children's status. We would see a greater fraction of children living in single-headed households. Finally, we even see health effects of these same shocks. So this shows you estimated effects on mortality among young adults. Many of you have heard of the work by Angus Deaton and Ann Case looking at deaths of despair, the rise in opioid deaths among US adults. This looks specifically at young adults, 20 to 39, and traces that to their exposure to these trade shocks, and we do see an increase in mortality. It's concentrated among men, and it is concentrated among the drug and alcohol poisoning is kind of the leading cause of that. So all of this is to suggest that this set of shocks did have a sizable impact on the kind of economic stature, social function, and even possibly the health or health behaviors and marital status of young adults living in these regions. So that paints a picture of something that was potentially quite destabilizing, that would be extremely salient to people living in those areas. And one last piece of evidence to suggest how salient this might have been. This figure is from a paper by Davis and von Wachter in 2011, and it shows you the relationship between the unemployment rate at the time someone is displaced from their job and their cumulative earnings losses over the next 3 years. And you can see there's this well-determined negative slope. So if you're displaced in a tight labor market, so when the unemployment rate is like 4%, people tend to lose about 10% over the next 3 years, 10% annually. If you're displaced when the unemployment rate is, let's say, 8%, you're more likely to lose something on the order of 30% of earnings. So you really don't want to be displaced when the labor market is slack. It's hard to get reemployed. You tend to get reemployed at lower wages, lower hours. What's interesting about this period, 2003, 2004, 2005, that's the brunt of the China trade shock. For reasons that are unclear, the unemployment rate was not especially high by conventional measures at that point, and yet the earnings losses were extremely sharp. So there are two possible explanations. One is that really we're just seeing manufacturing workers losing good jobs, and that is the explanation why that's so high. Another possibility is that the labor market was just a lot more slack than we realized in that period. In either case, people who were displaced in this period really did lose a lot, more than you would have anticipated. So you can see again why this would be salient. Okay, so now let me turn to the actual political evidence on this. So there's a number of papers that have looked at this. We know that in more trade-exposed political jurisdictions, US legislators became more likely to vote against trade bills. This is the work by Feigenbaum and Hall. We know that they are more likely to vote in favor of anti-China foreign policies. And among European voters, we see a greater rise in support for far-right causes in areas that appear to be more trade-exposed. That's the work by Collatone and Stanek, among others. So what we try to do specifically is to ask, do these trade shocks, does their political impact extend beyond voting on trade policy to make ideological divisions more extreme? Have they quantitatively altered the ideological composition of US elected representatives? And did they contribute at all to gaining Republican vote shares after the year 2000? So how might this work? It could work in a variety of ways. One is it could make elections more competitive. Another is it could generate turnover towards one or the other party. And the third thing is it could change, even without a change in party affiliation, it could change the ideological characteristics of those elected. So the way we try to do this empirically, and I'll describe this in very broad brushstrokes, we use the differential location of manufacturing sectors. We identify the sectors that are highly exposed, those that are not exposed. We find the set of products in which China has rising comparative advantage. We do that by looking at where its exports surge worldwide, not just to the US. We project those into the labor markets where those products would be built, right? And that's our measure of the trade shock. We then want to connect those to political outcomes. Now, as many of you will know, the political geography and the economic geography of the United States are not quite the same. So this is North Carolina District 12, often referred to as one of the most gerrymandered districts in the United States. You can see it's about 100 miles long, about 4 inches wide, and it follows a highway. In fact, the representative Mickey Michaud at one point said, if you drove down the interstate with both doors open, you'd kill most of the people in my district. That's how gerrymandered it is. So in developing our empirical strategy, what we do is those electoral districts often cross counties. We take each sub-piece component of the electoral district. We get the demographic characteristics of the people who live in that subcomponent. So these are district county cells. So when we're trying to account for demographic characteristics, we assign the characteristics of the people in that subsection of the congressional district. And then we tie the counties to the broader economic geography at which we measure the trade shock, what the US Department of Agriculture calls commuting zones, which are just clusters of counties that roughly approximate local labor markets. So there's kind of 3 levels that are being merged together. And hopefully that gives us a fairly good measurement of what we're looking at. It is a problem that US congressional districts are districted 2 years after each census. So our primary analysis for the House elections just looks at the period 2002 to 2010, in which the boundaries are consistent. In future work, we will extend beyond that, although it's with some loss of precision. Let me just skip right there. I've already described our voting sources, our data sources, and I won't go into them further. Let me kind of get to the main results. The first question we asked is, do they generate ideological shifts? So taking you back to this Pew data that I mentioned, we try to do an analysis where we ask, and I'm mostly not going to put up regression tables. I apologize for this one. I turned almost all of them into figures, but I ran out of time. This one tries to look at changes in ideological affiliation. And what you see is in areas that were more trade exposed, we saw a greater increase in this rightward measure. Higher values correspond to more rightward ideology. And it's concentrated among white non-Hispanics. We do not see any movement among other demographic groups. So it does say in the locations where the trade shocks occurs, we do see some shifting rightward in the people's responses on these attitudinal surveys, and they are concentrated among white non-Hispanics. All right. The next question we asked is, do we see a change in the nature of House elections? So we looked at three different types of indicators of that. One is competitiveness of the elections. The second is the financing, and the third is the actual outcomes. So we see, I won't put up the regression table, I'll just describe what we found. We find in areas that had greater rise in trade exposure, we do see an increased odds of direct competition between Democrats. So elections were less likely to be uncontested. We see increased voter turnout, and we see an increased share of registered voters who vote. So more people are voting, and a larger fraction of those who register actually show up. We also see an increase in individual campaign contributions. We don't see any change in corporate contributions. We don't have a strong theory about why. Interestingly, in terms of electoral outcomes, we do not see an overall benefit to either party. We don't see that this strongly favors Republicans or strongly favors Democrats. It does reduce the vote shares of the last elected party, meaning that elections are closer. But it doesn't, if you were simply looking at, did this benefit Republicans or Democrats writ large, the answer would be no. So let me skip the pair. So the next question we asked is, okay, well, you could have very little change in party and still have a lot of change in ideology if your elected officials change their voting patterns, or if you replace people of the same party with those of different ideology. So we looked at this question. So let me explain this figure. So there are for each district, there are three possible outcomes. You could have a change in party, you could have a change in representative, or you could have the same representative. And of course, if you have the same representative, you have the same party. These sum to zero. So on average, across all districts, we don't really see anything going on here. However, if we look at districts that are initially Democratic, you see a substantial increase in the likelihood of a change in party. In other words, more likely to be turnover. If you look in Republican districts, you actually see a decline in the probability of changing party, but a big spike in the likelihood of changing representative. Right? So suggesting that there may be within parties a reallocation of representatives to people with different ideological views. And just to show you the time series of this, we are only looking at this interval from 2002 to 2010. This shows you cumulative changes in party as a function of the trade shock, and cumulative changes in representative. And it's growing, but a lot of it happens late in the game. Happens between 2006 and 2010, or 2008 and 2010. And so that is really one of the limitations of what I have to present today, is that we're working on extending this to more recent years to make sure that this is not just a one-time blip that was then reversed. We don't think it was. There's nothing in what we read in the newspapers that suggests that, but it needs to be tested. So finally, we look at the ideological affiliation of those elected. And the idea here is, it's not that when we measure people's ideological affiliation by their voting patterns in the first 2 years in which they take office. But we assume that that is observable in expectation to voters. So their views are announced, they are elected to office, and then they carry out those views. So our assumption is that voters are aware of the way that people will vote once placed in office. Here's what we find. So this tries to estimate the effect of a trade shock on the likelihood of electing people of 4 different ideological stripes. Liberal Democrats, moderate Republicans, and conservative Republicans. Tea Party members, by the way, are a subset of conservative Republicans. And what you can see is that on average, the trade exposure measure that we see dramatically reduces the odds of moderates gaining or retaining office and increases the odds of conservatives. So primarily, it's not a major shift in party, it's primarily a shift in ideological affiliation. The biggest part of this is a fall in moderate Republicans and a rise in conservative Republicans. And just to show you again the time pattern, you can see that this effect on conservative Republicans is rising over time, but a lot of it occurs with the Tea Party election that brought them into office in 2010. It's also interesting to break this down just a little bit further and say, well, is this kind of occurs everywhere or does it occur in specific areas? So one thing we did was we split this into initially Republican and initially Democratic districts, so those that had a Democrat in office and a Republican in office. And what you can see is that in initially Republican districts, what's happening is they're not changing parties, they're just placing more ideologically conservative Republicans in office. So they're kicking out the moderates and putting in place conservatives. In initially Democratic districts, you see a huge drop in moderate Democrats, and then some rise in conservative and in liberal Democrats. So it's kind of bimodal. What is clear is the center is declining, and then the result is kind of fragmented. Just a final breakdown. Here we break this down according to voting districts that are majority white, non-Hispanic, versus the complement of that. So notably, I was surprised to realize that over 80% of all voting districts are majority white, non-Hispanic. So, which tells you how concentrated the minority populations are in the United States. So in those areas that are majority white, non-Hispanic, which is the vast majority of voting districts, what we see is pure rightward movement. In the subset, the 20% that are the opposite, that are quote majority minority, we see leftward movement, right? A decline in moderates again, but mostly to the benefit of liberal Democrats. So there is this kind of fracturing. Now, in the interest of time, there's more supporting details, but let me leave them out. Let me just finally talk about the presidential election. So you can easily apply the same strategy to look at presidential votes. For that, we can just look at the county level. We don't have to do this complicated district level thing because presidential votes are a state level outcome. And so we look at the change in the share of votes going to the Republican candidate between 2000 and 2008 and between 2000 and 2016. And let me show you what we see. So I've tried to put together a graphic that illustrates this. So this is the presidential election outcome in closely contested states. So where the Republican win margin went from positive 5% in Georgia to minus 1.5% in Minnesota. So this is the actual electoral outcome. Now, what we do is we predict that outcome as a function of the trade exposure to which counties experienced in this period. And we find that areas that had a sharper rise in trade exposure had more of a movement towards Republicans. And so we say, okay, well, let's imagine we unwound part of that rising exposure, so took off 10% of it. So if we reduce that effect by 10% and predict what would have occurred, and again, let me say, this is a hypothetical prediction exercise. The world would look very different in countless ways were it not for China's rise. But if we unwind that by 10%, we see Michigan go from the Republican column to the Democratic column. So right, and why? Because this is a closely contested state, and it had a lot of trade exposure. So it's not this is a huge movement. It's that when you're at the margin, right, little differences matter a lot in electoral outcomes. If we roll this back by 25% instead of 10%, we also see Wisconsin change columns, And if we roll it back by 50%, we further see Pennsylvania change columns. So this exercise, and I again caution, this does not correspond to an alternative universe. It's just a statistical adjustment. Says that if the trade shock had been half as impactful, that would have been sufficient to move 3 states that Trump marginally won to having Trump marginally lose those states, and that would notionally have led to a different presidential outcome. Okay, so let me just summarize, because I don't want to take more of your time. So I want to emphasize what I said initially, which is that the China shock is surely not the root cause of political polarization in the United States. It starts much earlier. It has, and arguably goes much deeper, but it has definitely been an accelerant. And it's been an accelerant because it occurred in a period where the U.S. was already having slow employment growth. It occurred right before the Great Recession. And of course, its impacts were concentrated in areas that were already economically stressed, where you had relatively low educated adults, many of them men, working in fairly high wage jobs that were lost rather quickly. So these effects were visible. They were arguably politically actionable. We don't really have a clear theory about why they would lead to polarization as opposed to simply movements in one direction or another. I could give you a number of hypotheses, but I don't think any of them is altogether convincing. I will say one thing that is clear is looking at the House elections between 2002 and 2010 and the way that the trade shock contributed to rightward movements, particularly in areas that were white, non-Hispanic, it makes the 2016 election result look less anomalous. In other words, a lot of that was foreshadowed, arguably, by what had happened earlier, although I will say that we did not ourselves predict it even while we were doing this project at the time. So I'd say there's a lot of other critical research on this topic, and our paper is only one small contributor. There's a sophisticated political economy literature on the supply and demand and shape of populism. There's work, as I mentioned, on the rising salience of these moral fissures. I think they're very important, but I don't understand what has magnified them. And also, I think a promising topic is this question of the kind of rural-urban divide. So if you look at, for example, an electoral map of the United States, you will see that 95% of the land mass of the U.S. voted for Donald Trump, right? The actual pockets of voters who voted the other way were in a very small number of places. They were numerous, but they were geographically concentrated. And that geographic concentration of political affiliation, I think, is something that describes a lot of advanced countries now, and I don't think we have a really clear handle on why. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
The WTO is the crucial turning point in David's argument, and if he's correct, she would have won the election without the WTO. I don't know if you
Again, I hesitate the world would be such a different place. It is the case that China's accession to the WTO was negotiated by the Clinton administration. Now, they were actually fairly insistent on negotiating a bunch of safety valves and blowout preventers, so to speak, into the China's WTO accession that actually gave them legislative power to say, things are happening too fast, certain industries are being too adversely affected, let's slow this down. But then those safety valves were not used by the Bush administration. So if you talk, and Alan probably has a lot of perspective on this.
Well, I was going to ask you, and then we'll let Tom go on with the discussion, whether you think WTO accounted for 50% of China's growth, which is what you need. That seemed, when I look at those charts, I don't see that much of an acceleration after 2000. There's some, but I don't think that, even if you believe you're counterfactual, which I don't, that 50% is the shock you would use there.
So China's growth is rapid throughout this period. There is a remarkable surge after 2001. In our 2013 paper in the AR, we estimate that about 40% of that drop between 2000 and 2007 would be accounted for by China's rise in that period. Not all that has to be the WTO.
Right.
Yeah.
40% is not
Yeah.
enough to swing.
I mean,
the election.
it's not.
He didn't have 40%, he has 25%,
Okay, wait.
50%.
Again, this is.
In fact,
I
whether
gave you
Michigan
all
votes-
a warning not to take that too
But your point is
seriously.
well taken about Monica Lewinsky.
Let me say first that I owe a great debt to David. I was thinking about the columns I write at the New York Times, and if there's one single source who I've used more than anyone else, I think it is him. And I think this paper does a really important service. He didn't go into it this much, but the papers that accompany the PowerPoint, he basically bridges what has been the big fight going on since the 2016 election. How much of it was economic, how much was culture, and how much was race. He makes the crucial point that in fact it's not an either or, and that economic scarcity in particular, or economic downturns, can have the effect of intensifying all the cultural characteristics that have been identified with the Trump voter, the authoritarianism, the racial resentment, all these different characteristics. So he has done in this work something that for political scientists I think is quite significant. They may not be happy that he's done it for them, but at any rate it is quite something. David raised the question, what has magnified the polarizing conflict? You have obviously, and something is going on. What I would suggest is that what's magnified it is that we have issues now that go to the very identity of people. People feel themselves to be a Democrat or a Republican, and they feel themselves to be white or Hispanic or gay. There has become an identity politics that encompasses both parties, and the people's identity as a Democrat and identity as a Republican has become so integral to their being that finding any kind of compromise is very difficult, and it has also resulted in a sharp heightening in the level of hostility between the two parties. The two parties now see themselves, especially Republicans, as in an adversarial conflict or a zero-sum conflict where the gains of one side are the losses for the other side. It is not a compromisable situation. And a lot of this grows out of the kind of social issues that emerged in the 60s and 70s. Abortion is not a compromisable issue. If you believe that life begins at conception, you can't say, well, we'll allow killing this person up until 6 months of life or 3 months, but after that you've got to save the person. And on the other side, if you believe abortion rights are crucial for the rights of women to become equal in society, full equal partners of men, then you can't compromise in the other direction. These have become deep, and all of these issues, though, have become deeply embedded in people's identity. And one of the striking things that emerged as we approached the 2000 election is an increasing sense among whites, especially working class whites, of a white identity. It used to be whites did not, as the majority, they didn't think about their identity. They just assumed they're white, this was there. As this election came, and as the notion that whites are going to become a minority, and as the Democratic Party, as the party of minorities, was overtaking them, the sense of a besieged white identity became stronger and stronger. There's a woman at Duke, I think she is, Jardina, who has done some really good work, and some other people who have done really good work on this. This has created a much more, anger has become an ingredient in politics to a level that it has not been before. David's paper also points to, but I don't think anyone has resolved this, something is going on with men, especially white men. There's something, they are clearly very angry. They are clearly separating from the liberal dominant culture that we have in this country. And they are prepared to support a candidate like Trump, who is, by normal standards, a deviant from democratic tradition. And part of this comes out of their sense of being screwed by the globalization process and losing manufacturing jobs and status, but it seems to be something much larger and more psychological taking place, and that deserves a lot more study. One question I had in looking through this is that David says that it has not had a partisan effect, these changes he points to, but all the data he supplied seem to indicate Republican gains, especially at the House level. I mean, at the House level and at the presidential level, for that matter. I mean, it did look like the gains from this process are in favor of the Republican Party.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's correct. If you had to say it was, the weight of the effect was to the right, there was some, I guess what we were trying to emphasize is that you do see this leftward movement in some subsections of the electorate, but I mean, absolutely.
But there were no net gains in Democratic districts,
that's right.
Whereas Republicans picked up some Democratic districts.
I mean, and probably a more accurate way to say it is a lot of the ideological changes were within the Republican Party, right, were the elimination moderates and the installation of much more ideologically extreme. And so that would be masked by pure measures of the, the number of Republicans in the House.
I think what this points to in the productive areas of research, insofar as that's important, is the Republican voter. Almost all academics and journalists are not Republicans and they're not conservatives, but the action is really taking place, in a sense, on the right. And what's going on in the minds of these voters has been the dynamic of American politics. If you look at the shift really since 1964, the elections from really of 1966 onward, the role of the white working class, that's whites without college degrees, has been crucial in more elections than any other demographic group, even though they are declining precipitously as a percentage of the population. In the last election, they were, I think, roughly 45% of the vote, according to new tabulations. In the 1970s, they were roughly 75% of the vote. So it's a declining group, but one that has exercised an influence over American politics over and over and over again. There's been complaints lately that the media is focusing too much attention on them. I think that's just the wrong complaint. And the more understanding of what's taking place there is where we should be going. But let me turn it over to Alan at this point.
Just because there's more room, I'm going to go up to it. Well, thanks very much. It's a real honor to participate and to be the last speaker of all 5 of the programs you've had. There's much in what David and Tom said that I agree with, and some that I have nuanced disagreements with. By way of background, I'm an economist. I'm not a political scientist. I've never even taken a course in political science. But I've had the opportunity to work very closely with politicians over the years, and I can share some observations from my experiences working as a government policymaker during a polarized time period. I felt like I had a front row seat when I worked as chief economist of the Labor Department in 1994, 1995. I assure you George W. Bush was not president then. Although he's looking better by historical comparison than I recall at the time. And my boss was Bob Reich, who was the top target for Newt Gingrich and Dick Armey. I went to Washington, I thought that we would expand the New Deal a little bit, and I ended up defending the Great Society. And then when I worked for President Obama, I got to see really extreme polarization and the cancerous effect it had on our politics. So I'll make 12 observations. My main thrust is I want to interject a note of caution in thinking about the causes of polarization, because as Tom said, I think they're very complex. I think economics plays a role, but we tend to point to economics and think that's deterministic. And I think, in fact, there are many factors. So first point is I'm a big fan of David Autor's work. I always have been since I met him as a graduate student. I think the work that he's done with his co-authors on the China shock is very credible. David knows this. I gave a copy to President Obama to read with a summary. The president read it closely. He handed it to his trade negotiator, to Mike Froman. Froman said, "What the heck is this?" And David also knows I taught his paper in my graduate labor economics class yesterday. And it's very good work. Of course, no empirical work is going to be totally compelling. The conclusion I take away from the paper is that China's participation in the global economy, because of improvements in productivity technology in China, because of WTO and other factors, probably accounts for about 1/5 of the decline in manufacturing employment that we saw. The paper says 21% is your conservative estimate, so 1 in 5. Well, that means that 80% is due to something else. So this is not denying the importance of trade, and I do think that trade has played a role in our decline in manufacturing, but the primary factor is going to be something else, and most likely automation, productivity growth, which has been taking place for a long time and across the entire world, including in China. Another point I want to make related to that is manufacturing is not what manufacturing used to be. Most of the people who work in manufacturing actually provide services. And there's a bit of a puzzle in David's paper in that the decline in manufacturing was not associated with lower manufacturing wages in those commuter zones, but was associated with lower wages in non-manufacturing. And all of the composition arguments you could make about why it would affect one and not the other, I think it would apply to both. So I do think that trade has mattered. I think the decline in manufacturing has been quite significant. In fact, when I worked for President Obama, I gave a speech right here at Columbia on policies to try to reverse the slide in manufacturing. So I think that has been an important feature of our economy, and I think David's done very good work reorienting the focus to put some weight on trade, but by and large, I think the main factor has to do with our production processes. Second, this isn't controversial, the last presidential election was extremely close and very consequential. It shows you the fragility of society, how we really live on a precipice. And basically, anything could have tipped the election. What James Comey did could have tipped the election. The interference from Russia could have tipped the election. You could go through any factor and say it was so close, it could have tipped the election. Third, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. I think we shouldn't forget that. It shouldn't have been as close as it was, but she did win the popular vote. Fourth, Hillary Clinton was a flawed candidate. I think she would have been a very good president, and I was very proud to advise her. But I think she had many weaknesses as a candidate. Fifth, Donald Trump is a flawed president. He's willing to say or do anything. He's truly, I think, a ruthless politician. I think we should view him as a politician. He did a very good job distancing himself, looking like an outsider, although he's had a very, very long career on the fringes of politics. I mean, he's had a policy on North Korea for decades, long before he officially became a politician. Part of Trump's success is that he was willing to exploit identity politics to a much greater degree than almost any other modern politician. This includes his anti-immigration stance, his announcement the day he announced his campaign about Mexicans being rapists and criminals, sexism and racism. And there's lots of evidence that when people are primed by racial clues, it affects their positions on various issues. It's not much of a leap to think it influences their voting. And of course, he also did exploit anti-trade sentiment. So that was certainly part of his strategy, criticizing NAFTA, criticizing trade with China, unfair trade with China. And to David's point, which I think actually is sort of the strongest evidence that there has been an impact of trade on political positions, Hillary Clinton abandoned TPP. When she was Secretary of State, she supported TPP. So clearly the political winds were blowing against trade in the 2016 election. And I'll come back to that because trade is always a controversial issue. And our president is so consistent that just today he floated the idea of reconsidering TPP.
Which he should.
Sixth point. I think there's a tendency to look at problems with the tools that we have, and I think David developed a great tool in the China shock, and it's good to use these tools over and over again, but the problem is I think it attracts almost too much attention. If, as David said, this is not the driving force, it couldn't be the root cause because polarization began before, long before China's great rise as an economic power. And that's my seventh point. I think trade is part of the story, but I think it's probably a small part. And in fact, if you kind of take the 20% estimate for manufacturing, manufacturing is only 15% share of the economy, and do the chain multiplication, the political impact is probably even smaller. I think the causes of our polarization, which are real, and I think the polarization has had profound effects on American society, American politics, I think they're much broader than just the trade shock in China in particular. You know, you look back at the graph that David showed from my colleagues Poole and Rosenthal, and the divergence between the parties began in the 1970s, which was long before, certainly long before WTO. And that's a point that David mentioned as well. I think economic factors tend to be overrated in elections. And this is not against my professional interest as an economist or an economic policy advisor. The economy was much better in 2016 than it was in 2012. If all that mattered was how the economy was doing, we would have had President Romney. I think Romney was a weak candidate. I think that the Obama team did a brilliant job in turning Romney's strengths into weaknesses. And Hillary Clinton was not able to do that with Donald Trump. And that's what I think should bother her most of all, because there were plenty of weaknesses to turn into even greater flaws. I think the candidates' personalities matter. My colleague Danny Kahneman likes to point out that people choose who they're going to vote for, then they figure out the reasons why they made that choice. That's often the way people make consumption decisions. I also want to emphasize the role of TARP, which hasn't come out. I think there was a lot of animosity in this country, justifiably, because of the financial crisis. And having participated at the tail end of the crisis at the Treasury Department, it was clear that there was a tremendous amount of anger. I don't think the government made missteps given the crisis that we were facing, but the financial crisis was fundamentally unfair. The fact that we would take taxpayer dollars and use them to rescue financial companies that put the entire economy at risk, financial companies that paid exorbitant salaries, even though those financial companies actually eventually paid back the TARP money, was tremendously unfair. And I think there was a mistake at the time not having made more fundamental adjustments in the way we treated the financial sector then. For example, you may not know this, but ESA, the law that set up TARP, imposed compensation restrictions for executives in companies that received TARP. We could have had those restrictions last longer. You know, my view at the time was companies like Citigroup or Bank of America, they were wards of the state. If it wasn't for the actions of the US Treasury Department, they would have been bankrupt and all of the employees would have been out of work. They should have been treated like civil servants. And that should have continued after the TARP program expired and after they satisfied the requirements to get out of TARP. And I think there was lingering anger. And really, you can't point to individuals who took actions that put the whole economy at risk and were punished. And I think one of the lessons I take away from that is that has affected our politics and made it seem like the whole establishment was stacked up against working class voters, and working class voters rebelled, probably by going to both extremes. I wanted to just mention, which David mentioned as well, congressional gerrymandering. I think that's a very important part of the story because many candidates face a greater fear of losing in a primary than they do in a general election, and that causes them to go to the extremes. I also want to highlight, which David mentioned, the role of the media. This is my 9th point, if you're counting. It's much easier now to seek out your own news and to seek out news that reinforces your conclusions. And there's a lot of evidence from psychology that people tend to do that, and I think that leads to more polarization. I think that can account for the twin peaks, for the bimodal distribution that David showed, certainly to a much greater extent than trade shocks, because this is cutting across many issues where you would think that the trade shocks would be focused mostly on trade issues. You wouldn't see that kind of clustering. My 10th point is the death of Harold Hotelling. Actually, Harold Hotelling died a long time ago, but I actually believe Hotelling's work told us a lot about the way politicians should behave if they want to get elected. So Harold Hotelling asked the question, where should companies locate? And the answer is they should spread themselves pretty evenly among potential consumers. And Anthony Downs took that and he turned it into a political theory, but it's basically Hotelling's idea. And for a long time, that was the dominant view, that politicians should go to the middle. Once they get their party's nomination, they should go to the middle. And if you look historically, I think that happened. And I think it happened until George W. Bush. I think that was a major turning point where Bush did not move to the center in the general election, and he won a very, very close election. Also, in the Electoral College, not in the popular vote. And I think what we're seeing since then is that candidates are tailoring their message not to the center, but to the extremes. And the technology has probably improved to the extent that they really can determine where it is that they could position themselves without going to the middle, yet still get over 50% of the vote. And essentially what this has been doing is turning our elections into base elections, where the candidates focus on their core base, the views of their base, who tend to be more extreme on both parties than is the case for the general population. I think part of the problem is that voter turnout is so low. It's hard to get people to vote. This might be related to bowling alone type things where just people are too busy to get engaged and to do things. To me, it means we have to make it easier for people to vote. I think that will I think it'll change where politicians position themselves, and I think it will change our politics, and more people will be satisfied with the result, which is what I wanted to turn to next, the consequences of this. And this is probably where the only topic where I'm qualified to speak about on this topic. Polarization, when I worked in the government, was really devastating, particularly on the issues where the public is less polarized than the politicians. And I wanted to highlight 3. One is the minimum wage. Republicans and Democrats both support the minimum wage. The minimum wage now is $7.25 an hour at the federal level, has not increased since July of 2009. Red states have been raising their minimum wage. That's a sign that it cuts across parties. Yet our political process is not responsive to the views of the citizens. Second is background checks for guns. I worked for President Obama during the Sandy Hook shooting. And he said this publicly, I heard him say it privately, that was the worst day of his presidency. And he still gets emotional when he talks about it. And I remember driving with him in a limo coming back from a speech he gave, and I said, you know, aren't you frustrated about the budget? We couldn't work out a grand bargain. And he said, that doesn't bother me so much. That'll get worked out in the future. What bothers me are things like gun control, background checks, where we had 80% of the American people supporting doing better background checks before people can buy guns. And then third is infrastructure investment, where there's certainly a consensus among economists, and I think the public, which is not as enthusiastic about investing in infrastructure because they don't really appreciate the importance of infrastructure, or the word is not as friendly as other terms. Both President Trump and President Obama have not been able to increase our infrastructure spending. And in fact, the tax bill that passed the Congress is probably going to reduce infrastructure spending, given the way it treats state and local governments. Second, and related, a lot of sensible, non-controversial fixes cannot get enacted. On both sides, the Affordable Care Act was not a perfect bill. There's some flaws in the way it was written. There are some fixes which, even though you might not like the Affordable Care Act, it would certainly make the world better to make it easier for companies to demonstrate that their employees are covered by health insurance. The way the law is written was a bit crazy, in that you have to go employee by employee, month by month, to show that the worker had health insurance, where I think it would be fine for IBM just to attest, yes, we satisfied the law, then they could be audited. And if they don't, but that couldn't be done administratively. That would require a legislative fix. And no one wanted to open up the Affordable Care Act to legislation because who knows where that would end. And the same thing with the tax bill that just passed. The bill was written hastily, and that is going to create problems. And it's not going to be possible to fix all of them with administrative actions. And I think people might not like the tax bill, but they're not going to open it up to make those fixes, which historically happened all of the time in legislation that Congress passed. Third, the federal government can primarily do just what it has to do, just the bare minimum. What that means is, in an emergency, like during the financial crisis, it can pass things with bipartisan support if it really, really has to. What else does it have to do? It has to raise the debt ceiling. Now, that's beginning to change a little bit. The latest spending bill is an example of Congress working the way it used to, which is not always so pretty. This is one of those examples of be careful what you wish for, where Congress opened the spigots and we saw so much additional spending at exactly the wrong time. It's really a great irony that we couldn't stimulate the economy when government spending would have had enormous macroeconomic benefits, and we are now overstimulating the economy when we really don't need it. And then lastly, on the consequences, well, second to lastly, on the consequences, we put off addressing big problems. President Obama wanted to get a grand bargain done with John Boehner. He thought he was going to have it done. I was involved in the negotiations. I was involved at the time in designing what the policies would be to address our long-run budget problems. And Boehner just couldn't do it and keep his job. Now, 6 months later, Boehner ended up giving up his job. But it means that we just kicked the can down the road, and it means that we're going to have trillion-dollar deficits for a long time to come. That's not the end of the world, but at some point it's going to be a serious problem, and at some point we're going to have to grapple with these problems. And of course, trade deals are much harder. The only reason I had optimism that we might pass TPP was that Paul Ryan championed Trade Promotion Authority. Trade Promotion Authority gives the president the authority to negotiate a trade deal, bring it to Congress, and then Congress has to have an up or down vote without amendments on it. You basically cannot pass a trade deal without Trade Promotion Authority. Paul Ryan fought to get TPA passed, but then he saw that it was hopeless and, like other politicians, ended up abandoning TPP. Trade votes were always hard. They always required largely Republican votes and a small number of Democratic votes to get them over the finish line, and that's going to be much, much harder. So let me conclude by saying, pessimistically, to the extent our problems are due to rising inequality and the polarization that David has done such good work on in our economy, which results from trade, but I would argue from many other factors in addition to trade, I think they're going to get worse before they get better. And I say that because inequality tends to feed on itself.
when we have inequality in income, that is going to reduce inequalities and opportunities. The opportunities that children who come from wealthy families have are so much greater than the opportunities from children from low-income families that I think that the gap is going to expand. So I think these are extremely important problems to solve, and I hope someone finds an answer.
Sure. That was terrific. Thank you, Alan. That went well beyond my paper, and I learned a lot. It was great. Let me, I agree on with many of the things Alan said. First of all, and hopefully I made some of these same points, that when an election is close, everything matters. Everything's marginal. The reason the trade shock might have been consequential in the election is not because it actually changes so many votes. It just happened to be in the places where the contests were close. It may or may not have done that, but that's what our estimates suggest. I completely agree that personalities matter, that politics is not an economically simple determined equation, and that there's a huge role for political entrepreneurship. And Donald Trump was brilliant at that in the sense, he may have many, many shortcomings, but he really captured the zeitgeist in anger about trade and anger about immigration. Whether they're valid or invalid, he kind of found a gusher and opened it up and channeled it effectively. And, there were 16 other Republican candidates, all of whom were supposed to be great, and none of them had that capacity. So clearly, he was onto something. So I completely agree that the election could have turned differently if there had been different candidates, and not hugely different candidates. As I fully agree that trade is certainly not the cause of political polarization in the United States. It's the primary cause, since we know it goes back much further. The only thing I would say is I do think that the decline in manufacturing has been primarily a technological phenomenon, rising productivity. I think the very, very dramatic change that we saw between 1990 and 2007, it's hard to identify what technology that was that caused that fall off of 20% of manufacturing employment. It may not just have been WTO. I think it was very much trade related or China related. Let me step back a little bit. It's actually a puzzle. So it was not anticipated that China's WTO accession would have such a large effect. The growth of the merchandise trade GDP deficit, merchandise to GDP deficit was 2.5 percentage points, quite enormous. It wasn't thought that would occur because China already had permanent most favored nation trading status in the United States and had that since 2000 or 1999, meaning they'd already enjoyed the lowest tariffs. So in some sense, I think it was thought that China's WTO accession would cause it to reform and to open, and that would be good, but it wouldn't really be a qualitative change in the trade regime it faced within the United States. So why did it have such a large effect? And I don't think we know the answer to that question. There are a couple hypotheses. So one hypothesis that goes to Peter Schott at Yale and Justin Pierce of the Bureau of Labor Statistics has to do with sort of the reduction in uncertainty. That there was this kind of overhang of potential tariffs, the so-called Smoot-Hawley tariffs going back to the 1920s before the Great Depression, and that those could have, in theory, been put into place any given day if the U.S. had been in a bad mood and China didn't have most favored nation trading status. So the elimination of that uncertainty itself caused a huge increase in penetration and integration. And I don't find that hypothesis very plausible, but the data actually support it pretty strongly. So I'm of mixed minds about that. Another is that China's WTO accession didn't have such a large effect on its access to the US market, but did have a lot of effects within China that made it a much stronger competitor. So in particular, China got reduced tariffs on lots of things it imported from the rest of Asia as an assembler, right? And so that lowered its output prices. Simultaneously, WTO caused China to close a lot of state-owned enterprises and eliminate an implicit export tariff it had on itself, which is that every firm that wanted to export had to partner with a state-owned bank, and that was eliminated as well. So China became a much more competitive competitor in a very short order. And then there was some currency manipulation that went along with that. So again, China's rise, as I said, is a good thing, and it's not primarily a fault. It was just an unexpected change. Our estimates, although it's 20% for the full period, we estimate that 40% of the employment change in the 2000s through 2007 was due to the trade shock. So I think it's a fair amount, but it's not all WTO. And I again want to emphasize this point that the Clinton administration, when it negotiated China's WTO accession, really was worried about this. And Gene Sperling, actually went and, there was an initial move to sign. He said, no, I don't want to do that. I'm going to go to Beijing and I'm going to get these agreements that gives us these safety valves. And then if this goes badly, we can just break the glass, ring the bell and things slow down. And then the Bush administration was hostile to that idea. So lots of industries did in fact go to the Bush administration seeking relief. And they said, don't be such a bunch of whiners. Everybody knows that globalization is a win-win. And I think one thing that we know from economics and that politicians don't understand as well is that trade is not a win-win. It raises GDP. Trade among consenting nations, in theory makes them all wealthier, but it typically has adverse distributional consequences. And in a high-income country like the United States, when it integrates with less developed nations, in general it's going to raise the price of skill-intensive goods and services, and it's going to lower the price of labor-intensive goods and services, and those price changes are going to feed through to wage changes, and it is going to exacerbate inequality. And because manufacturing is very geographically concentrated, that will not be dispersed, a small percentage drop for lots and lots of people. It will tend to have a very localized impact. I think the hope was, well, it would spread out quickly and therefore, it wouldn't remain in its initial location, that it would just, people would reallocate and dissipate and maybe wages fall a little bit for some. Turned out, as we now know, that places didn't bounce back rapidly for a variety of reasons. So I think it was very salient. But my main takeaway from, I do not want you to come away thinking that the main takeaway is that China trade is responsible for our politics. That is definitely not the case. I think it's an accelerant, but there's much more to understand. I think my paper points to how little we understand, not how much we solve this puzzle.
So we have time now for questions. Maybe I'll ask the first question. It's about the role of economic forces in creating political narratives. I mean, so one of the things that I took away from the election was that, so regardless of the technical impact of China, that the developments gave Trump a narrative that made sense to voters, and he gave them a theory that made sense to them, which is that you're not doing well, and the reason you're not doing well is because immigrants are taking your jobs, and because of unfair trade deals are screwing you. And elites don't care, and the Democrats don't care because they care about the interests of feminists and non-white people, and you're getting screwed. And Hillary Clinton didn't have an affirmative theory that made sense to them about fixing their lives. And so one question is whether there is an affirmative theory that could be communicated to people that she just wasn't able to communicate, or whether it's just too complicated to fix things. But it seems to me that economics can play a role through narrative, so that's the question.
Well, I certainly agree with that. There is an aspect of trade and immigration which are different from what drove a lot of the manufacturing changes, which is you don't get a vote on numerically controlled machines or robotics, but you do on trade. And I think that makes trade more of a lightning rod, and you could say the same thing about immigration. And then with immigration, you could throw in some racism and xenophobia, and makes it even worse. David used the analogy of open a gusher. I would say pick a wound, and a wound that politicians on both parties were reluctant to do because they knew how ugly it could become. On the narrative, I think it's even more than a narrative. I think it's showing alignment. And what was remarkable, you look at the way that Obama ran against Romney and the way that Hillary Clinton ran against Trump. Trump was from a much more privileged background than even Romney was. Yet somehow Trump became the representative of the working man, where nothing in his background and nothing in his policies, I would argue, would support that. And Hillary Clinton was not able, I think, to come across the same way in the same kind of human terms. And that's why when I said I thought she was a flawed candidate, I think that was the main reason. For whatever reason, she was not able to come across as personable and empathetic, sympathetic, even though she is, to those who have been in difficult economic times for quite a while. And I don't know why she had so much difficulty with that, because when I've interacted with her, which I did as a member of the cabinet and I did part of her campaign, she's a very caring, warm person. I think that she'd been in public life so long, it sort of made her wary and made it hard for her to trust people in a certain sense, made her more formal and come across as more stoic and stodgy than she actually is. So I think it's not only the narrative, I think it's the emotions that the narrative brings out in people. That's the way I would describe it.
Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead.
So for Dr. Autor, have you done any research on the on statewide elections and the effect that deindustrialization has had? I'm from Michigan, and a large part of Rick Snyder's success, at least in 2010, was that he actually polled much better among African Americans than McCain or Romney did in presidential elections. I'm curious if you had any research on statewide elections.
Yeah, so I confess I haven't worked on this, and I'm not super expert on really what's happened. I've looked only at national things, so I apologize for my own ignorance, and others may have a better knowledge base. But since I'm speaking, let me actually fill in a slightly different picture, which was, Tom raised the issue of what's gone wrong with men, so to speak, and a lot of Tom DuPrett's work is about the changing gender roles in U.S. society, and not just in U.S. But I do think that, and this ties to this question of the narrative, I think a lot of non-college adults are saying, we're doing the same things we're always doing, yet they're not working. And what is the story that explains what has changed? And I think telling the right story wrongly, whether it's right means one that makes psychological sense, whether it's accurate or not, is a very powerful way to organize people. And so one reason I sort of put up all those figures about the way the trade shock was particularly disequalizing for men and women, or at least changing their traditional gender roles, is specifically because my hypothesis, which I probably could have better articulated, is it does create this threat to identity, this threat to what is your social standing, what is your economic and social stature. So it has nothing whatsoever to do with state elections, but thank you for that question.
Okay, thank you.
By the way, can I add one thing there? I think Obama sensed that in 2008. When Larry Katz and I met with Barack Obama at the end of 2007, and he talked about steel workers losing jobs, and the new jobs are in healthcare, and it's very hard for them to make that transition. And that was part of the reason why he supported infrastructure expansion, because displaced steel worker could work in construction. So, and I think successful politicians have that kind of a feel. So he was ahead of your work, which may be one of the reasons why he was so happy to get a copy of it.
Also, I would just say that Hillary did not have a narrative for these voters that she lost. I mean, she was not addressing their concerns. She was very focused on identity politics issues, and she had policies in her portfolio, but her rhetoric on the campaign trail and what you saw on television just was not addressed to these issues in the same way that Obama did to some extent, and Bill Clinton did to a great extent well before her. Go ahead.
In Raj Chetty's recent paper on the economic disadvantage of African Americans, particularly African American men, he constructs a variable on racial animus by, I'm not sure if it was commuting zone, but some regional breakdown. And he also finds that in areas with particularly low levels of racial animus, there's somewhat less economic disadvantage that African American men end up suffering. So I guess my question to you is, first of all, have you looked at this variable and seen whether it explains the degree of reaction of different commuting zones? And then second, are there areas that showed less reaction than would be suggested based on their loss of manufacturing jobs? And what other variables might explain that less reaction?
These are tough questions. So I believe the gentleman is referring to the recent paper by Nathan Henry and Raj Chetty and a couple other co-authors about looking at economic mobility, and they've done very widely discussed work on the different locations, commuting zones, or clusters of counties in the U.S. where there seems to be greater likelihood of going from rags to riches or lesser likelihood of going from rags to riches. And that work has not looked at race. It's just looked at, because they didn't have race data available. So the recent paper links race data to tax data, and the big finding is that you have downward economic mobility among African Americans. In other words,
Especially men.
especially, that's right, almost entirely men, in fact. That sort of, there's a kind of a slope of kind of 0.3 between parents' earnings and kids' earnings, but then for African Americans, so for white kids, it might look like this. For African Americans, it has the same slope, but it has this -10. And so we have this, and then they try to characterize what things are predictive of African Americans doing relatively better or worse. The things that appear predictive are neighborhoods that are less racially segregated, and the ones that have much higher prevalence of fathers present in the household. But there are very few areas in which African Americans live that look like that. So there was, I'm just summarizing the paper here, but an implication is that there will not be rapid convergence in racial income levels because of this downward mobility among African American males.
I'll add a little bit to that because I saw Raj present the paper about a week ago. That result that David ended up with was totally obvious because over the last 100 years, there's not been a rapid convergence. There were a couple of periods of convergence after World War II, after the Civil Rights Act passed, and then periods of stagnation. So in retrospect, it was clear that he was going to find stable distributions. And basically what he found is that the African Americans are regressing to a lower mean than the whites, especially for men, not so much for women. I think it's a very useful finding. He added 2 additional variables to look across the areas to see what can account for, possibly predict faster convergence, which is related to your question. One was a measure of searches for discriminatory words in Google, and the other was kind of a test of bias with samples that were large but not necessarily representative. I don't know what to make of those. I mean, I worry a lot about ecological fallacy and a lot of what he's done, even though I find it extremely intriguing work. And it's unclear what to make of that. But it certainly does fit with the narrative that racial animus is part of the story of American life still.
Although,
David has done some work on this. I mean,
racial animus?
well, no, on the issue of mobility and getting ahead, especially with single parents and non-single parents, which I think would be relevant to this.
Sure. So, I mean, let me just say, in terms of the electoral outcomes, right, minorities voted, only in very small numbers for Trump, right? So they support whatever other factors are inhibiting minorities. It's not inhibiting their support for Democratic candidates. It is the case that a lot of the resentment towards immigrants and so on occurs in places where there aren't that many immigrants. And I think this is true for a lot of racial resentment as well. So I think it's remarkable that, of course, the group that, African American males, which are the group that has, strong downward economic mobility, does not seem to be the angriest group of people in the American electorate.
Because that's been true for a long time. That's not a new development for them.
Right. Yeah, so my own work, yeah, I tried to look at, trying to understand, this relates to Tom's work as well, trying to understand, why does it appear that males in general are thriving less in our educational system and in our labor market than they used to, relatively less relative to women, and why particularly so among African Americans, and trying to ask about neighborhood factors and family factors. That's sort of probably beyond the scope of what everyone's necessarily interested in here today, but I think it's nice to see a lot of social scientists and sociologists, political economists, all trying to put their heads together around this, very complex ball of issues.
Professor Autor, I wanted to ask you about the implications of increasing ideological polarization for policy responses to external shocks. And in particular, the external shock I wanted to consider was Chinese approach to industrial planning and policies such as Made in China 2025. It seems as though an efficient answer would require long-term decision-making, but our political system is gearing us towards exactly the opposite.
Yeah, so just to make sure I'm clear on the question, I think you're asking there's whatever you think was or was not important about the quote China shock and its rise of employment in labor-intensive industry, the likely big challenge ahead is China's move into a lot of human intellectual property-intensive leading sectors, including software, electronics, motor vehicles, aircraft, electricity generation, and so on. And there they do have a very, kind of statist policy of huge state subsidy, not a very accommodating attitude towards the intellectual property of other countries. And this is seen by many, I think, as a real threat to the economic leadership of a lot of other industrialized economies. I think this is a legitimate concern. I really do. Others may disagree. It's interesting, of all the dumb things that Trump has done, the one thing I think that he's done that isn't as dumb is to raise this as an issue. And to suggest, a lot of his musings about trade, I think, are totally off base. They are what we call mercantilism. They think that, exports are good, imports are bad, and that's just not the correct way to think about it. However, there really are strategic interests in you make large investments in intellectual property, you don't want them appropriated. Although I don't, even though I don't own Apple or Google or Microsoft, I'm glad those companies are U.S. companies to some extent. That has a real effect on the GDP of this country and the overall level of prosperity. So I think in the first part I just wanted to state that I think I agree with the thrust of the question, that this is a real concern. In terms of the likelihood of collective action, I guess the one thing you could say about us versus them policies like trade is they're more likely to be aggressive action on that than there are things that are actually hard because they involve transferring among citizens. So it's quite possible that we actually would see radical trade policy changes. I'm not saying well thought out ones. I just think that they're much more conceivable than deep reforms to Social Security or something. It would actually be really hard.
And they don't require a congressional vote in many cases.
Yes. Please go ahead.
I agree, David, with what you said, but I would add the way he's going about it is dumb.
Yeah.
Because China's actually made strides. They've made enormous strides in their currency. It's a little bit hard to say their currency is undervalued today, especially given the policy of Secretary Mnuchin. And I was just in China 2 weeks ago. They have made improvements on intellectual property. Tencent, which is their Spotify, is going to pay out $1 billion in royalties. And they've done a tremendous job policing, at least when it comes to music, all of the pirated copies. And it's fascinating why it came about, because nobody buys CDs anymore. And streaming is a convenient way of providing music. So they've actually made some strides. I think they're planning to make more. It's not unusual for emerging markets to appropriate some intellectual property. We did that in the US. If you go back to the 19th century, Charles Dickens didn't make any money from his books here. He made money from touring in the US, just like a rock band. So I think the way to go about it is with the coalition of countries. Yeah. And what he's done is to thumb his nose at the coalition and to challenge the WTO, and I think that's going to make it harder to make progress. But I don't think he actually cares about making progress on many issues. I think this gets back to
comment we had before. I think he cares about having an issue, showing where he stands on an issue. I think he feels that American people don't follow it so closely, so they know the outcomes, it's complicated, and he kind of stakes out his position, and that's what he cares about. There's been no follow-through in many things that the administration has started, like the response to the opioid crisis. So I think it's more a different type of identity politics, where he's identifying with the issue, and he wants people to think that he must be doing something because there's all this reporting on it. But the way that a policy analyst would look at the issues is totally different, because we would try to look at the outcomes, which is not something that they put much emphasis on.
And TPP being the leading case in point, right? The Trans-Pacific Partnership, it had many bad things about it, many good things as well, but it was certainly set up to protect intellectual property, to create transparency and freedom of contracting, and China was not a signatory. The idea was to set up a bulwark that China would eventually have to adhere to, and no country was more delighted when Trump ripped it up than China, and no country was more devastated than Japan, right, our ally. So now ironically, of course, they're talking about joining TPP, which is great, right? I mean, I'm all in favor, and I'm glad other countries went ahead with it. So, but that's where you would start, right? You would start with something like, here is the template we would want to use for, setting up the ground rules, and we wouldn't begin by alienating our allies by taxing their steel and threatening their cars and so on if we're trying to bring them along on board on this much more challenging, forward-looking issue.
Could I just raise one question to you, David? If you have men in particular, where male industries are the driving force in this shift because of trade, and they are moving to the Republican Party, prior to Trump, why would they choose the Republican Party over the Democratic Party? There's really, on trade, if anything, the Republicans were more free trade. It does not seem to be a trade-driven decision in that sense.
Definitely not. No, good question. Yeah, and I'm, again, I'll use Alan's disclaimer. I'm not a political scientist either. I think there's kind of, my understanding, my perception is that the two poles of American politics is, one is the kind of race war, and the other is the class war. And Republicans work very hard to use the identity side of this. You need to identify as a white male against foreigners, against immigrants, whatever, and that would move you towards Republican parties, views, which are, don't support all those special interests. And then the Democratic Party tries to get you to view things in terms of your economic interests, right? It's the wealthy versus the working class, and we're the party that's going to champion the working class at the expense of the wealthy. And so what seems to be in play there is which group you can more successfully get working class whites to identify with, either the identity view or the economic view. And those have had different degrees of success at different points in time. Part of it, I do think, depends enormously on the actual candidates and their ability to, if you think about a lot of the Democratic almost winning presidents, or even those that have succeeded in winning, they're not people who are good. Jimmy Carter, great man, non-effective communicator. Mike Dukakis was like Hillary Clinton. John Kerry almost won, right? I mean, the Onion had a story. They said, John Kerry campaigns through America on the deck of his yacht, and they had him, the yacht being pulled by a trailer down a highway. And I thought that perfectly personified why he would not have been successful. It's not that he didn't have his heart in the right place or didn't have good policies, but he somehow lacked the common touch. Bill Clinton obviously had it, so did Barack Obama. So a lot of this really does come to personality, not simply policy platforms. You couldn't figure it out from that.
I think that just one other thing I would throw in here, though, is that the Democratic Party has increasingly become the party of the well-off. And it's concentrated in the growth of communities. It does much better among educated voters than uneducated voters, so that its credibility to these swing voters that you're focusing on, they just may not believe it to be a party that will represent them, because it has become, it is no longer the lunch pail party, it's the party of the Upper West Side.
I think it's historically been the case that what's changing is that the well-off individuals have typically favored conservative parties, and the Republican Party is wealthier on average, right? Members of the Republican Party. The unusual thing is that the educated are also affluent and yet are liberal. And that's kind of a surprise because they don't seem to be supporting the set of policies that would be most in their immediate economic interest. So go ahead.
Thank you. I guess kind of following up on the recent discussions around about education and any correlation with identity politics and education. Two-part question. First part is just generally for the research that's been done up to date, is there any sort of correlation we can see between education levels or just levels of higher education and political polarization? Because my recollection is that that's not the case, then even individuals who have a higher levels of education are just as likely, if not more likely, to be to have polarized public opinion. And the second part to that is more along the lines of, to the extent that educational institutions, universities like this, have a role in shaping the discourse around politics, what then can they do to help stem this tide of identity politics and the polarization that results from that?
Well, I think the evidence is pretty clear that the parties are diverging more and more on education, and Democrats are winning the better educated, and Republicans are winning the less well-educated. This was striking in the last election, but it's been a long-term trend, and it really is, I think, changing the character of the Democratic Party that I certainly grew up with when it was the party of the guys you saw on the subway at 6 a.m. Those guys are now increasingly Republican insofar as they are going to their lunch pail jobs. And the educated communities across the country have just switched, and it's really driven by the social issues. Well-educated people are liberal on social questions of women's rights, abortion, and so forth, and that's what's driving them. Bill Clinton really helped make that shift accelerate sharply, but so did the Republicans. This is way before your day, but in 1992 they had Pat Buchanan and Pat Robertson at their convention, and both of them gave fire-eating speeches. And after that, the Republican Party started losing places like suburban Philadelphia, Westchester County, Suffolk County, even DuPage County in Chicago. All these places began, and it is a ongoing realignment of the parties taking place. But it's made these economic issues, very difficult for the Democratic Party. Barack Obama tried to change a program called the 529 Education Savings Program. This is one where you could put money away.
It's a subsidy to the wealthy. It's a subsidy to wealthy families.
You probably use it.
I do.
I wrote the report on changing it.
And it is a program that is outrageously beneficial to the very super rich and only modestly beneficial to the middle and even less so to the working class guy. So Obama came up with an entirely legitimate, along Democratic lines, proposal, written by you, I guess. And then the shit hit the fan. And it was Democratic shit that hit the fan. It was Chuck Schumer. It was Nancy Pelosi. It was Chris, the new senator from Maryland. People who have affluent constituencies in San Francisco, in New York, who said, you just can't do this. My people, i.e. my Democratic voters, aren't going to let me do this. And Obama had to back off. And it was Democratic opposition that killed that. Would you agree?
I think that's true, but I think it's a minor issue. I think on the big issues like raising the minimum wage, which means much more money for more people, or an income tax credit, I think that the programs of the Democrats hasn't changed that much.
I would like to see
tax policy in general.
Proposing tax policies that start costing Bucks County and Montgomery County voters
Yeah.
actual.
Tax Reform Act of 2012 raised the top rate from 35 to 39.6%.
That's a very top
But,
rate.
so
Well, it hits those voters you just mentioned.
Some of those voters, yes.
one thing that the question points to is, I do think that Republicans have recognized that higher education is now a political battleground, and that in fact higher education is a breeding ground for liberalism, and
Yeah.
they view higher education as a political threat. And I was on a panel recently with Labor Secretary Acosta. He said very negative, hostile things about higher education, what a waste of money, and that we should be putting people through alternatives. So did Secretary Wilbur Ross, the Commerce Secretary. So I do think it probably is the case that education is a threat at some level to the Republican Party as currently fashioned. They have recognized that, and it shows up in tax policy. It shows up in the way endowments of wealthy universities were slapped, sort of gratuitously by tax reform. And it also
We're going to do worse with graduate.
and even the efforts to sort of, at kind of creating polar division within higher education. So Milo Yiannopoulos, before he had his little moment with the priest thing. So it's a really important area, and others have woken up to it.
So we've reached the end of our time, and I'm sorry I have to sort of close this because I think we could talk for another hour on these issues. So thank you very much for a
Thank you all
really
very much.
stimulating conversation.